love this new technology. But I'm glad it hasn't sounded the death knell to traditional editorials. They continue to offer a strong, robust opinion, well expressed. And while I might disagree with some of them, passionately, hearing the opinions of others forces me to clarify my own. My guest today has the passion, persistence and force of a good editorial. Kim Workman's ideas come from a lifetime being up close and personal with people who've broken the law. People like the man the media dubbed New Zealand's baby-faced killer, Bailey Junior Kurariki. His support for Bailey is a response to what Kim sees as the public's thirst for retribution.
He had been denied home leave because of public outcry. He had been taken out of a rehabilitation program because people felt that that was inappropriate. So here we have, a kid that's trying to do the best to change his life. He didn't get any help from community probation to speak of. They knew, I think, that he was smoking cannabis. They did nothing to tell him or raise it with his minders. Instead, he was visited by 30 police in a helicopter and the media. There comes a point at which we have to say, well, what are we trying to do to this young man? He's had 7 years in prison. He was identified as the baby-faced killer from the word go. Nobody can tell you who the 3 people are who actually committed the murder. He was a lookout, and he's not being given the chance that he's really entitled to.
What do you think we are trying to do with him?
Well, public are generally trying to harass him and to make his life
Why do you think that, Kim?
Because I think we live in a punitive society that simply wants to carry on with the punishment after the court has, dealt the sentence. There's still more to come. And that's not going to help him change his life. That's not going to reduce the number of victims in society. All that does is confirm that, that we live in a pretty mean-spirited world.
Kim, you were born in 1940 in the Wairarapa. And tell us about your childhood times.
Well, my father's Maori and my mum came from an Australian-Irish background. We grew up in Greytown, and right from an early age I gravitated towards the marae. All my friends were Maori, and really I was the only one of my family that did that. My father, when he was a child, had been discouraged from engaging with Maori children. And Dad was quietly supportive, I think, of me and the direction that I was taking, and so was my mother. But the girls, were not encouraged in that way at all. For me, it was a huge amount of fun. Our kapahaka group would go out and perform in these country halls, and then we would have a dance afterwards. And by the time I was 14, I was playing the piano at these old-time dances. I remember those days with a great deal of enjoyment. But I also remember when I went to Wairarapa College and elsewhere that there was a lot of racism. I saw my father being treated badly in the local community, even though he was, an impeccable citizen. He was a very quiet man, he was very industrious.
How do you think, Kim, that your father's dislocation from his Maori culture affected him?
I think it was one of the factors that impacted on him quite severely, although he never talked about it.
You talked about playing piano.
Yes.
Was that something that your parents approved of?
They encouraged it. It probably wasn't a good idea because in those days, if you played in a band, The people not only paid you, but they gave you lots of beer to drink.
Oh, right.
Yeah, so,
You saw this as a bonus.
well, I saw it as a bonus then and developed a bit of an appetite, you know, which wasn't great when you were trying to sit school certificate.
Right.
Dad was very worried about my behaviour. When I was 16 or 17, I was quite a lad, and he and the local policeman cooked up a plot to put my name forward for the police cadets, and to everyone's amazement, I was accepted. And really, you know, I'm not sure that I had much of a part in that.
With the best wishes of Mr. Nash and Minister of Police Mr. Connolly, and proudly watched by relatives, the 19-year-old cadets exchanged their berets for the helmet of a policeman.
And I ended up being a policeman for around about 16 years. It was an interesting time for me because it was at the time when there was the Maori urban, you know, migration. You know, they just couldn't cope with the urban community. They were spread out, pepper-potted throughout the region. They weren't allowed to live together as a community. And we saw the genesis, really, of the gangs. We saw the emergence of the mongrel mob and then Black Power.
Was it easy being a Maori in the police force in the 60s and 70s?
No, not really. I found it difficult. There was a lot of racism. A lot of the police officers' only experience with Maori were in the Tramway Hotel or the Victoria Hotel in Petone. So they had a view of what Maori were like.
So a lot of it was built on stereotyping of one kind or another.
Oh, very much so. When I went to Masterton, I was in the local kapahaka group, the Maori Anglican group, and I had a memorandum from the police inspector instructing me not to take part in a group because it was embarrassing to see a member of the police cavorting in a grass skirt.
Right.
So
Right.
I responded and said I would certainly do as he asked if he would agree to disband the police pipe band. And the conversation ceased at that point.
Kim, at a certain point, you developed an interest in and a connection with the spiritualist church.
Yes.
How did that come about?
My third child died of, well, it was a cot death. And it devastated the family. I think we all felt in some way guilty and responsible. And I don't know why I did it, but I went into the spiritualist church in Petone one Sunday night.
May I come to you? Yes. And I'm feeling a vibration.
And the clairvoyant, the medium who was speaking, went to me and gave me a message which sort of identified my great-grandfather and identified where he was living on this island years ago, and gave me information that no one else could possibly have known. And to me, the spiritualist church was the nearest thing I could imagine to the way in which our old people saw things and understood things. And that led to a 10-year connection. I was trained in that time as a medium and clairvoyant. I was the secretary of the National Church for 3 or 4 years, I think.
Gosh.
But gradually I realised that this didn't seem to be of God. There were things that happened that seemed to be more about people playing power games. I sort of mentally adjusted and decided that my goal in life was to be ambitious and forge a career for myself.
And in fact, you followed that path. You had quite a string of increasingly prestigious appointments, didn't you?
Yes.
You worked early on in the Ombudsman's office in its infancy.
Yes, and then went on to the State Service Commission, district manager of Maori Affairs in Rotorua, and then a deputy secretary in Auckland finally head of the prison service.
And a number of these things you've been talking about, the compassion, concern for justice, actually led you to institute a series of reforms within the department. What sort of thing were you looking to do there?
Well, one of the things that happened when I worked in the Ombudsman's office was I was in charge of investigating complaints from prisoners. So during that time I had the opportunity to visit a lot of prisons and realised that prisons didn't work. There's a culture in prisons which says that violence, is the king. So I went into that job knowing that, and then thinking about how can we make prisons a more humane place in which if people want to change, they have the opportunity to do so.
Do you think the reforms you were able to bring about made a difference?
Yes, I do. Education programs increased threefold. The prison incidents declined by 75%. There were less escapes, and the prisoners reported that they were generally happier, with the way they were treated. And I believe that the prison officers, in the end, were happier too. Mm. The difficulty was that inevitably, in any prison, you're going to have serious incidents which become public fodder.
One of those incidents was the food for a significant spiritual experience for you.
Yes.
Tell us about that.
We were having a lot of trouble at Hawke's Bay Prison. And one day, a prisoner stabbed a prison officer with a screwdriver, and the prisoner concerned was taken to Wanganui Prison. But there were 3 witnesses that were left there, and I rang the prison and said, I think it's wise to keep them there. And he said, they'll be fine, and that was on the Thursday. By the Sunday, I was feeling a bit uneasy. I went to sleep. And about 2 a.m, I had this visitation. It wasn't a dream, it was an absolute visitation. And here was this person at the foot of my bed saying, those prisoners are in severe danger. And I felt that it was Jesus talking to me.
It was very concrete and real.
Absolutely. And I rang the prison inspector and said, look, I want you to drive up to Hawke's Bay Prison and just check to ensure that those guys are okay, and I want you to leave sort of now. And then about 7:30 in the morning, he rang me and said, I hate to tell you this, but those 3 prisoners have been severely beaten. And it transpired that they've been held in an outside yard, naked, for 2 or 3 days, and beaten by about 12 prison officers. So we had a real issue on our hands. As a result of that, 12 of these prison officers were suspended and ultimately dismissed. The media made a real song and dance of it, and 2 of the MPs went public and called for my resignation. So things were looking bad, but when they did that, I was expecting a phone call from the minister saying, don't worry, son, we're supporting you. But no phone call came. And I realised too that no one was visiting my office anymore, so I knew I was in...
You were in Coventry, yeah.
Yes. That night I went home to Carolyn, my wife, and said, I think I might start looking for another job. I think my days might be numbered. I got one phone call, however, from a member of the mongrel mob who said to me, you're in deep trouble. Do you want me to take a contract out on them? And I think he was joking, and I did stop for 5 seconds or so, but then I said, no, I don't think that's a good idea, and we just laughed about that and chatted about what was happening in the prisons. And he said he was really appreciative of the efforts that I'd gone to minimise violence. And the next day when I went to work, here he was sitting on the footpath outside the office. And I said to him, you know, what are you doing here? And he said, oh, I've come to offer you, to support you. So we went up to my office. He had a friend with him, and we talked for about an hour and a half. And at the end, he said to me, oh, before I go, can I pray for you? And he put his hand out on my arm and started praying. And I said to him, are you a Christian? And he said, well, I'm working on it. And later on, he did become a Christian. So that had a profound effect on me, because up until that time, I had dismissed any thought about ever having a spiritual
You're
life.
the determined atheist.
Yes. You know, I have to say that impacted heavily on me, because these guys were sufficiently generous and graceful to recognise that I was having a go at making a difference in their lives.
So Kim, have you ever reflected on the thought that if you were the leper in that situation, the mongrel mob leader was the Christ?
Yes, that was my reflection, in fact. And I'm not saying that I looked at him and saw Christ, but I sensed the presence of Christ. And it was at that point that it confirmed for me something that I'd really always known, that when you go into a prison, you don't take Christ with you. Christ is already there. And these guys, given a chance, will express Christ to you in all sorts of different ways. In 2006, at our prison fellowship conference, we invited them to the conference. It was very interesting to see what happened. The first conference, they wouldn't eat with us. They sat out on the lawn and ate their food there, and wouldn't come into the conference. They just sat outside and sort of talked amongst themselves. By the second year, they had contracts that they were delivering for government around such things as anti-graffiti and drug education. And in the last year, they were very much, you know, seeing themselves as part of the community. They were facilitating reconciliation between competing youth gangs, doing a lot of very valuable youth work in the community. And that progress has only come about because we've spoken to them, engaged with them, made them feel as though they could contribute.
Kim, the spiritual experience that you had in relation to the events at the Hawke's Bay prison, it stayed with you and evolved further through your association with the Elim Church.
Yes. And at that stage, I was processing, you know, this experience that I had. I was starting to feel a lot of that burden lifting from me. Walked into the church, sat down, some Fijians in front of me started singing quietly. The music was beautiful. And the next thing, I found myself weeping, you know, uncontrollably. And on the way home, I said to my wife, do you mind if you change churches? I'd like to go to this one. And I spent, I think, 8 years at Elim.
You were involved in setting up some prayer ministries and so on?
Yes, I was. And they asked me if I would set up a Maori ministry. We would meet at 5, eat a big boil up, you know, pork bones and puha and stuff. And all the people from the community would, street people and others would, found out that this was happening, so they would come. And then we would have prayer, and that would go on for whenever, and singing. And so the group grew from like 15 to about 60 in about 3 months. And a lot of the people that came had high needs. So they were people that needed a lot of pastoral care. These were people that came from a background of mental illness, drug and alcohol abuse, dysfunctional families, violence. And it became a point, I think, of difference for the church, and there was a bit of discomfort with what was happening. By introducing this new group, it changes the culture of the church, and whether the church can sufficiently adapt to that, you know, is questionable.
So you moved.
Yes.
Where did you go?
Well, I ended up with a small community church in Apuni in Lower Hutt, which we love. Wonderful pastor.
There once was a girl who was raised in a home where God was honoured, but the teachings of the Bible were not held in such a high place as tradition was.
So as someone who was a determined atheist,
Yes.
to someone who's seen Jesus at the end of his bed and had an overwhelming charismatic experience,
Yes.
and continue to reflect on that, how do you understand God now?
Well, let me say that I certainly believe in the existence of God.
Heavenly Father, it's you who draws us together this morning.
I believe that I have a personal relationship with God and commune with God constantly. I also believe that I have a mission with God, and that all the things that happened prior to my conversion were in a sense an apprenticeship, a preparation for the life that I was to have subsequently. And that my calling is in the area of justice and social justice. God for me is my counsellor, my father, my support in times of trouble. I couldn't imagine surviving without him. Having said that, if you asked me what God looked like, I couldn't tell you. And, you know, the wider issues that people grapple with, I also grapple with in terms of the nature of God. But right now, you know, I'm very comfortable with my perception of God. Well, afterwards...
One of the things you've been committed to is the development of faith-based prison units.
Yes.
Tell us about how that's come about and what they actually do, how they actually work.
Right. Essentially what it is a sort of a place where people in prison can come to, a haven almost, for those who want to explore their relationship with Christ. Every night they have a meeting where they talk about, you know, who's doing well, who isn't, who needs correction, who needs support.
It says by your grace that we are saved.
There is biblical teaching 4 days a week, but more than anything else, they learn to live as a Christian community. They learn to reconcile differences peacefully, so they're trained to do that. They learn to help one another and to care about others. And the experience of that has been absolutely unbelievable.
What's the reoffending rate of people who go through the unit?
We think it's probably in the order of 20 to 30%.
Wow. So significantly
it's about half of what you would expect otherwise. The secret to that, of course, is that we have mentors who come into the prison 8 months before the prisoner leaves the prison, and then supports the prisoner and their family for up to 2 years after they leave.
You have to be a Christian?
No, we've had Buddhists come in, Muslims, Hindu. There's no compulsion on anyone to convert. They make that decision.
So along with this, Kim, you've been an advocate of restorative justice.
Yes.
We should talk about that because it's not well understood, I think.
The idea is that it's an opportunity to bring the offender and the victim together so that the offender starts to appreciate the harm that they've done in the cause of a crime. When you send someone to prison, you're actually not holding them accountable at all if they're removed from the people that they should be accountable to.
Are there some people who just have to go to prison for long periods of time?
Yes, there are. And I would say that 5 to 7% of the people that are in prison today should probably never come out. Oh. There is a case for saying that these people will never change. Unfortunately, in the public mind, I think they think that about 40% of the prisoners are in that category, and they're not. In fact, a huge number of the prisoners there today are are likely to stop offending by the time they're about 30 or 35. 40% of them in prison today are serving less than 6 months. 85% will be out within 2 years. So the reality is that these guys are going to come out and live in our neighbourhoods,
Yes.
whether we like it or not. And then the question is, do we want someone who's better for the experience or worse? And if they're worse for the experience, why do we put them in prison? Are there other alternatives like doing reparation or community work, getting into treatment programs and so on? We haven't had that debate since the 1960s, and we need to have it now because I think everyone's totally confused. What has happened in the last 20 years is that the purpose of prison has changed without anyone mandating or discussing a change. So the purpose now is really incapacitation. In other words, we have got someone who's naughty. The longer we can keep them in prison, the longer they...
We're taking them out of the loop, really.
Yeah. Keep out of our hair. What they unfortunately don't appreciate is that the longer you keep people in prison, the more likely they are to reoffend when they leave. So we're into this business of deferring the inevitable rather than dealing with it immediately.
And that's why we pursue Bailey Kururiki Jr. when he comes out of prison.
Yes, exactly. And it's why we devise constantly new ways of punishing. We've got the 3 strikes. They want to now remove their voting rights. We've had double bunking, locking people up for 16 hours a day. And people are now saying the punishment that the court dispenses is not enough. We have to find other ways of punishing.
Can you see that corner being turned and our society becoming a more compassionate and constructive one?
I would like to believe that we might turn that corner. There comes a point at which either people are not prepared to spend that money, or there's some sort of change in moral values and so on. So for me, the place where I would think we would want to start is with the churches, because a lot of people in churches think exactly that way. And when you start thinking about how that relates to the gospel and what Jesus said, it's not a very good fit. So if we can talk to the churches and explore that, that theology of forgiveness, of grace, of compassion, then perhaps we might get some changes.
Supporting local content so you can see more of New Zealand on air.